Okay, this video covers Chapter 3, Section 1. Chapter 3 is about demand and supply, and in Section 1, we're going to talk about demand. Before we start, let me highlight a few of the key concepts that you should focus on in this lecture. So make sure that by the time this lecture is over, you are able to distinguish between the concepts of demand and quantity demanded. This is really important. And also the difference between movement and a shift. So both of these in point 2 are really important. Movement and shift and demand and quantity demanded. Why is that important? Well, because oftentimes you'll watch the news and the reporter will say something like, an increase in the price of oil has caused demand for oil to fall. That, it turns out, is not possible. But the reason for it is because journalists and economists mean something different. Well, to put it more precisely, economists mean something very particular when they say demand. So demand and quantity demanded are different. Here you have a demand curve. And you also have a demand schedule. So what's the difference? Well, a demand schedule is a table. So this is a table, right? You have 2 rows and 6 columns. And it tells you at every price what quantity do consumers want to purchase. And this is in millions of pounds, and we're talking about coffee here. So on the x-axis, you have quantity. And this is important because we always put quantity on the x-axis. So just to emphasize that, I will draw it here. Then on the y-axis, we have price. And to emphasize that, I'll draw a P here. So you should be very, when you draw a demand and supply curve, automatically the first things you should do are draw the axes and then label them Q and P. And please do not mix them up. Price is on the y-axis, quantity is on the x-axis. And so how do you go from a demand schedule to a demand curve? Well, you just plot the points. We're going to be working with straight line demand curves, right? So in principle, demand curves might curve in one way or the other. But we're going to be assuming, for simplicity, that they're straight lines. It turns out they always slope downward. That's the law of demand. We'll talk about this in a second. But let me give you one trick to remember. You can label the curve D and associate D not only with demand, but also downward. Okay? So let's plot this. So at a price of $9, consumers want to purchase 10 million pounds of coffee. So we find $9 and 10 million pounds of coffee, and we draw a dot there. Then we take the next point, $8 and 15. So find 8, find 15, draw the point. And so on. You can draw all these points and then connect the lines. In fact, you only really need to do it for 2 points, right? Because it's a straight line. So find this point, and then draw the line. Right? That's demand. Now, I mentioned there's a distinction between demand and quantity demanded. The distinction is as follows. This whole curve shows us the demand. And this is, at any given price, what quantity would people want to purchase. So it tells us a lot of information, right? Knowing the demand. And also very important to emphasize that we are holding constant everything else. So remember this Latin expression, ceteris paribus, which means all else unchanged? Well, we're holding constant, for example, the incomes of consumers, their preferences and tastes, the price of related goods. We'll talk about all of these in a moment, but those are assumed constant. Assuming those are constant, we plot the demand curve. Now, quantity demanded is a much more specific and limited concept. When we say quantity demanded, we mean at a specific price. So for example, at $8, quantity demanded is 15. This whole curve shows us the demand, but this point shows us the quantity demanded at a specific price of $8. All right? So here's why the news reporters sometimes say things that economists don't with respect to demand. If the price of gasoline goes up by $1, what does that cause to fall? Demand or quantity demanded? Quantity demanded, right. So many things can cause demand to change, as we'll see, but only one thing, but a change in price of the good only causes quantity demanded to fall. Okay, so I'm going to try to re-emphasize these concepts. We do have definitions here. I think I've defined them all already, more or less. But the law of demand, I'll just emphasize. Essentially, and to put it very shortly, demand curves slope downward. And what does that mean? Well, if the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. If the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So in other words, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, and that's the law of demand. And you would have to think very, very hard to find an example of a product where if the price goes up, quantity demanded goes up. If you found that, that would be a violation of the law of demand. Also important to emphasize, we're holding a lot of things constant, right? And so keep that in mind. If you think you have a counterexample of something when the price goes up and quantity demanded goes up, think, is everything else held constant in your example? Because if not, you have not found an example that violates the law of demand. Okay, so demand can change, and in particular, we're going to look at movements and shifts. Here we have a shift in demand. We had the old demand schedule that was graphed and labeled D1, and then something happens. And let's try to think of what might have happened. Before, at a price of $9, consumers wanted to purchase 10 million pounds of coffee. But now, at a price of $9, consumers want to purchase 20 million pounds of coffee. So what might have happened to cause this change in demand? Well, consumers might have changed their preferences. So when I was growing up, everybody drank very thin coffee that didn't have a lot of flavor. It was not until fairly recently that Starbucks and high quality coffee became popular, right? So now you can't even find this old, even McDonald's now has better coffee, right? So there's a change in preferences, perhaps, that explains this. And this is a shift, because if we plot this new demand schedule, we're going to get a totally different curve. So the change in preferences caused demand to shift, right? The price of coffee, we're not told what the price is. If we were, and the price changed, then that would be a movement along the curve. But this is a totally different curve. Likewise, demand can fall. So here we see a reduction in coffee demand. And what could have caused a reduction in coffee demand? Well, nearly anything is the answer. There's only one thing that could not have caused the demand for coffee to fall. Does anyone know what that is? A change in the price of coffee. Because a change in the price of coffee can only cause a movement along the demand curve for coffee. But anything else that happens could cause the demand for coffee to change. And so maybe now consumers became more conscious of their health and so they're switching to tea in order to have less caffeine, for example, right? Or maybe their dentists tell them, hey, your teeth are getting stained. Stop drinking so much coffee. Or so advertising campaign emphasize the clean teeth, so then people are demanding less coffee. Maybe the price of tea went down, so people are switching to tea for that reason. But for many, many reasons. Now, although in principle there are countless reasons why demand could change, we are going to give you a list of a few categories of what we call demand shifters. And here they are, so you should write these down. First of all, preferences. And this should be pretty straightforward, right? If preferences for coffee change, demand for coffee is going to change. Right? What about prices of related goods or services? Well, by related goods or services, we mean complements and substitutes. What is a complement of coffee? This would be a good that is consumed with coffee. Milk, donuts, right? So these are complements. And what are substitutes? What's an example of a substitute? Tea, Red Bull. If those things change, the prices of those goods change, there will be a shift in the demand for coffee. But again, I'm going to repeat myself. If there is a change in the price of coffee, that does not cause a change in demand for coffee. It causes a movement along the coffee demand curve. But change in the price of other goods will cause demand for coffee to change. And here is a figure that summarizes the effects of changes in the prices of these related goods. And so, for example, if you reduce the price of a complement, like a donut, that's going to increase the demand for coffee. If you increase the price of a donut, that's going to decrease the demand for coffee. That should make sense. Should be something that you've seen yourself, and you can appreciate that through introspection, right? Your own experiences. What about substitutes? Say tea. Well, if tea becomes more expensive, people are going to stop drinking tea, right? And consume coffee, so increase demand for coffee, and vice versa. I might illustrate this in the following way, and also to emphasize the difference between a movement and a shift. So let's say this is the market for tea, and this is the market for coffee. So first we draw our demand curves. What do we label the x-axis as? Quantity. And the y-axis? Price. This should be automatic for you very soon. And likewise here. So here, let's say this is the market for tea. We have a demand curve, and the price goes from $5 to $6. We're going to move along the demand curve, and so maybe our consumption goes from 60 million pounds to 50 million pounds. Now, what is going to happen over here in the market for coffee? So the price of tea went up for some reason. We moved along the demand curve, and the quantity demanded of tea fell. So what's going to happen over here? There's going to be a shift, and it's going to be an increase. So we're going to move to a new demand curve, call it D prime. Okay. Income is an important demand shifter. We already mentioned preferences, changes in preferences, changes in the price of related goods, also income. So if income goes up, what's going to happen to the demand for coffee? Probably goes up. But we can't assume that increases in income will always lead to increases in demand. For example, some of you eat ramen noodle soup, right? And sometimes you guys eat at McDonald's and so on. I used to eat a lot of that kind of food when I was a student, but nowadays I don't eat as much ramen noodles, at least not those freeze-dried, the 10-cent packs. And I haven't gone to McDonald's in a while. So as income increases, demand for some goods actually falls. Ramen noodles is a good example of that. When you're making $1 million a year, you're not going to buy any more ramen noodles, right? And the distinction of whether demand increases or falls determines whether it's a normal good or an inferior good. For most goods, as income increases, demand increases. So most goods are normal goods. But if income increases and demand falls, we call that an inferior good. They list demographic characteristics as a demand shifter. And I agree that if the population increases, say we get a bunch more people in our country, then the demand for coffee will increase because they're going to consume more coffee. They talk about, however, the share of the population of various ages could affect this. And you might say, well, isn't this a taste? Couldn't we put this under the category of taste? Expectations influence demand. Okay, so this last part of this video just emphasizes that this is a heads up. A change in price of the good causes movement along the demand curve for that good. But anything else that happens causes demand either to shift to the right or to the left. All right, lastly, we have a case in point article on campus parking problems. And this is an example that I like very much, in large part because much of my, in my research, I do work in transportation economics. And so parking is an interesting problem. Not only on college campuses can it be difficult to find parking spots, but in many cities it's also difficult. For example, if you've been to San Francisco, you know that it's not easy to find parking there. They have recently implemented a new kind of experimental program called SF Park. Has anyone heard of it? And so if you, next time you go to San Francisco, take a notice of the parking meters. The ones that say SF Park on them have the rate, you know, the price that you have to pay per hour changes. And so if it's a peak period, the price goes up. And if it's not a peak period, the price goes down. And so this is something that economists have thought of. You know, what do you do if you don't have enough parking? You continue to make it free or basically free? No, we need to raise the price, right? So if we raise the price, the quantity demanded will fall. This case in point article talks about how changing the price of related goods and services could cause the demand to fall. For example, if you give away free transit passes to students, they will use transit more and drive less. Is that a shift or a movement in the demand for parking? It's a shift in the demand for parking. But increasing the price of parking meters, like in San Francisco, is a movement along the demand curve, right? So you could write a case in point article like this that illustrates movements versus shifts.